Hello my crochet friends, this is Sarah from Ned and Mimi, and in this video we are going to talk all about crochet gauge. Now I know for a lot of crocheters gauge might not be the most exciting topic in the world, but I promise you if you want to crochet a garment or any other project really that needs to end up being a specific size, then this is something that you're going to absolutely have to get your head around. And I promise once you get a handle on it, it will just become second nature. So let us dive right in. In the video, we are going to cover what exactly is gauge and why it is so important. We are going to talk about the correct way to make and measure your gauge swatch, and then finally we will talk about gauge troubleshooting, so what to do if you cannot match the gauge given in a pattern. So let's go back to basics first and talk about what exactly is gauge. So in crochet terms, gauge is simply a measurement of stitches and rows in a given area. And this area is usually a 4-inch square, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And if you have a more complicated stitch pattern, like a lace pattern, for example, the gauge measurement might be given over 5 inches or something slightly different to 4. But usually it is over a 4-inch square. And on to our next definition, what is a gauge swatch? So a swatch is simply a small sample made using the same yarn hook and stitch pattern that you are planning on using for your project. So this is really important that for your gauge swatch, you treat it as a little mini project. And I know making gauge swatches is not everyone's favorite thing, and it's a step that we're all tempted to skip every now and then. But if you are making something like a garment that needs to fit and needs to be a specific size, then rather than being a waste of time, making a gauge swatch is actually going to end up saving you a lot of time in the long run. So in a few minutes, we're going to look at how big our gauge swatch needs to be and how we're going to use it to measure our gauge. But first of all, let's just take a look at a sample gauge statement here that you might see in a crochet pattern. So this is how I write my gauge statements, and you might see them written slightly differently, but they're all going to give you basically the same information. So the first thing this statement is telling us is that the stitch pattern for our gauge swatch is going to be double crochet. So that's US double crochet, so a very easy stitch pattern. So this might say measured over shell stitch, measured over V-stitch, measured over whatever the stitch pattern in your particular project is. The next thing that this statement tells us is that for this particular project, in order for us to meet the gauge, we are going to want to end up with 13 stitches in 4 inches. So if we have 12 stitches or 14 stitches in 4 inches, we have not met the gauge for this pattern. And then finally, it's also telling us that we're going to expect to have 7 rows in 4 inches. And if we can do all that, then we have met gauge for this pattern. So you might sometimes see a gauge range given on a yarn label, and this can be very useful when selecting the yarn that you are going to use for your project, but it is not really relevant to the particular pattern that you are making. So for this example, we can see that the gauge range on the label is 12 to 17 single crochets. So for my gauge swatch, I want to have 13 stitches in 4 inches, so this yarn should be okay. But the most important thing to pay attention to is the gauge given in a pattern and not necessarily the gauge written on the label here. So it's a good guideline, but it's not the only thing that you need to consider. So before we get stuck in and have a look at some gauge swatches, let's talk for a few minutes about why gauge is so important and why we need it. So the first thing is that it gives us a baseline so that the designer and the crocheters and the makers are all starting from the same point. So gauge really ensures that crocheters with all different styles and different tensions as they crochet can follow the same pattern and achieve the same results. So even if you crochet slightly differently to me, as long as we are getting the same gauge, we can be pretty sure that our projects are going to end up the same size. So as a side note, in the UK, gauge is written as tension, and this actually makes perfect sense because our tension, or how tightly or loosely we crochet, has a big impact on our gauge, or if we can match the gauge or tension written in a pattern. So gauge is also really important because it gives us confidence that what we were making is going to turn out the size that we expect. And not only that, it's going to give us confidence that we are going to purchase or have to hand the correct amount of yarn. So you can imagine if you crochet a little more loosely than I do, for every stitch that you make, you're going to use a little bit extra yarn. And for a small project, it might not make a huge amount of difference, but if you're making something like a sweater, you're definitely going to want to know that the yardage given in a pattern is what you are going to need. And matching gauge is one way to give you that confidence. And then finally, I like to treat my gauge swatches as a chance to do a little experimentation. So maybe try out a stitch pattern that I haven't used before. For example, you might come across a pattern and think that you would absolutely love to make it, but after spending 10 or 15 minutes working a gauge swatch, you decide, no, that's not for me. It's much better to find out early that you don't want to proceed with the project rather than to spend a lot of time on it. And also I find doing gauge swatches a great chance to try out a new hook or new type of hook that I might have used before, or to get a feel for a new yarn. So it's just a little way of putting a more positive spin on the time that you're going to be spending making a gauge swatch, and look at it as something enjoyable and a chance to experiment rather than something that you absolutely have to do. So now let us get on to the fun bit, making our gauge swatches. So before we start crocheting, there are a few things that we just need to keep in mind. So the number one thing is to make your swatch big enough. So for example, if your gauge measurement for a pattern is given over a 4-inch square, then you want your swatch to be at least a 6-inch square. And there are a few reasons for this. And the main one is that when you are taking your measurement, there are little gaps in between each stitch. And if you were to measure the stitches at the start and end of a row, they don't necessarily have the same gaps that you have on the internal part of your swatch. So if you were to include those stitches in your measurement, it wouldn't necessarily be accurate. And also, if you're making a double crochet swatch, for example, you'll often start your row with a chain 3. And this chain 3 is not the same size as a regular double crochet stitch. So height-wise, it's probably pretty close, but width-wise, it is not the same. So you can't really count this as one of your stitches in your gauge measurement. And another reason that I have found why it's really important to make a good big gauge swatch is that often when I start off any project, whether it's a swatch or a full project, I often tend to crochet a little bit more tightly at the start. And I think that's probably because I'm concentrating a little bit more. And as I relax into a project and get used to a stitch pattern, I definitely tend to loosen up a little bit. So if I was to just crochet a couple of rows and take my gauge measurement there, it wouldn't necessarily be accurate. And what I want to do is make a swatch big enough that it's going to reflect how I'll actually be crocheting a project. And before I move on, I'll just talk for a second about blocking. Now, sometimes in a pattern, you will see the gauge measurement given for a blocked swatch. And if you see that, it's very straightforward. You need to make your gauge swatch, block it, and then take your measurements. If it doesn't specify whether the swatch should be blocked or not, what you can do is have a quick look at the end of the pattern and see if there's any blocking instruction. And if there is, usually what I'll do in this case is make my swatch and measure it. And if it's very, very close to meeting the gauge, what I will do is block the swatch and then take the measurement again, and hopefully it should be spot on at that stage. And if not, then it's time to do a little bit of troubleshooting, which we will get to in a minute. So now the fun bit, how to make and measure our gauge. So if we are thinking about the example that we had earlier, where we are expecting to have 13 stitches in 7 rows in our 4 inches, that means that we're going to have to make our swatch at least 20 stitches by 10 rows. So there isn't an exact formula for this, but you're just going to want to have a few stitches either side of those 13 and a few rows at the top and the bottom of your 7 rows. So just make it a little bit bigger than what the gauge statement tells you. And now here are my top tips for measuring your gauge swatch. So number 1 is to use a hard ruler. don't be tempted to use a measuring tape. If you're really stuck, it will do the job, but a hard ruler is much more accurate. And if you have a gauge square, by all means use that. A gauge square is simply a wooden square with a cutout in the middle, and the cutout is usually 4 inches by 4 inches. For knitting gauge squares, they're often smaller. It might be 2 inches. So for crochet, you're going to want a 4-inch one. But honestly, I just prefer to use my ruler, because sometimes if there's a lace stitch pattern that doesn't fit neatly into 4 inches, I just like to have the extra room that a ruler gives me. My second tip is to use pins. So these are going to help your measurements to be a lot more accurate. So what you will do is lay down your ruler on your swatch, place a pin at the 0 inch or 0 centimeter mark, and then place another pin at the 4 inch or 10 centimeter mark. And I find that this helps me with accuracy, and by putting the pins down exactly where the ruler lines appear, I'm a lot less tempted to try and squish my swatch a little bit to make it fit, or to try and just get an even measurement. I just put the pin down exactly where it falls, and then I count my stitches. And if the pin lands in the middle of a stitch or halfway through a stitch or a row, that's where it goes, and that's going to give me the most accurate measurement. And then finally, it's really important with your swatch to take more than one measurement. So as I said earlier, I often find that my first few rows are a little bit tighter. So if I was to take my measurement on one of those rows, it wouldn't necessarily be accurate. So we're going for a consistent gauge measurement in 2 or 3 places on your gauge swatch. And if you get 2 out of 3, you can probably be pretty confident that your gauge is on track. And now to the fun bit. What do you do if your gauge does not match the one given in a pattern? Well, luckily there are several things that we can try. So the first thing we are going to tackle is our stitch gauge. So this is assuming that you have either too many or too few stitches relative to the gauge statement. And we're going to tackle this one first, because often if you can sort out your stitch gauge, it should take care of the row gauge as well. Not always, but often this will be the case. So the first thing that we can do is change up our hook size. And this is the most common piece of advice given if you are having trouble meeting gauge, and that is for a very good reason, because this is the thing, aside from your own tension, that will really affect your gauge. So let's break it down. So let's assume that you have too many stitches in your 4 inches. So in the example from earlier, we were expecting to have 13 stitches. So say we have 14 or 15. So for you, that means that your stitches are too small and you need to make them bigger. And to do that, you are going to try a larger hook. Now, on the other side, maybe you have too few stitches. So maybe you only got 12 stitches in your 4 inches. In this case, your stitches are too big and you need to try to make them smaller. And to do that, you're going to need to try a smaller hook. So this might take a little bit of trial and error, and you'll have to use some judgment here. So if you are out by 2 or 3 stitches, you might decide to go up or down a couple of hook sizes. If you're only out by a tiny little bit, one hook size change might do the job. And with time, you will kind of get to know what your average gauge for, say, a worsted weight yarn or a DK weight yarn is. And you might be able to even adjust your hook size before you make your gauge swatch. So if you know that generally you have about 14 stitches in 4 inches and the pattern is telling you that you need to have 15, you know that maybe you'll need to use a smaller hook size there just to try and squeeze in that extra stitch. And that brings us on to the other thing that we can do. Now, really, I think you will only find yourself here if you are finding that consistently your gauge or tension is off across a number of different patterns. And this might be because you crochet quite tightly, so you are finding that you are constantly having to go up hook sizes. And if you crochet quite loosely, maybe you're finding that you often have to go down a hook size. So if you're only finding that every now and then you need to do something to match gauge in a pattern, you probably don't need to work with changing your tension and changing the hook for that particular pattern will be absolutely fine. So if you find yourself in this position, then I really, really empathize with you, because for the longest time I was the tightest crocheter ever. I could never meet gauge. Things that I made were always too small, too tight. My fabrics were always too stiff because my stitches were just so small and close together. And this was something that I had to tackle myself. So if you do find yourself here, know that it's a little bit of work, but it's not completely impossible to change your tension. So if you crochet a little bit tightly like me, there were a couple of things that I found helped. The biggest one, I think, was the way that I wrapped my yarn around my left hand. So I'm right-handed, so I held my yarn in my left hand. So usually I wrap my yarn around my little finger once, and while I was trying to work on my tension, what I did was just removed that wrap. So I just let the yarn kind of flow a little bit more freely through my fingers, and that really helped a lot with my tension. And in general, just being mindful to try and relax. Notice when I was getting really tense, notice when my hands were kind of starting to get a little bit tired or cramp up. For me, they were all signs that I was just crocheting too tightly. And I do notice that this creeps back in every now and then, but in general, I would say that I have loosened up a lot. And then on the opposite side, if your tension is consistently too loose and you're always having to go down hook sizes, you could maybe try the opposite. So instead of wrapping your yarn around once, maybe you can wrap it around an extra time on your non-dominant hand where you're holding the yarn, and that should help a little bit with the tension as well. A few other things that you can try are to change the types of hooks that you're using. So a lot of the ergonomic hooks that are out there now, especially the ones from Furls, I have found have really helped me to just hold the hook a little bit looser, so I'm not kind of grasping it quite as tightly, and that has really helped with my tension. And you might find that you always lean towards metal hooks. Maybe you could try using a wooden hook instead, or vice versa. So there are a few little things you can do, and just know that it's not impossible. It is just going to take a little bit of awareness and a little bit of concentration as you work. So now let us move on to troubleshooting your row gauge. So I know from messages that I have gotten that lots of people find themselves here. So you have met stitch gauge, but your row gauge is still off. Now the good news is there is a bit less work here. So if you can meet the stitch gauge, you are definitely more than 50% of the way. So if we need to adjust our row gauge, the first thing we can do is to adjust our style. So this is less work than adjusting our tension in general, but it just means that we're going to be pulling up a little bit more or a little bit less as we work. So again, let's break it down. So if you have too many rows in your gauge measurement, that means your stitches are too short. So what you need to do is just try and pull up that loop a little bit higher. So when you yarn over and pull up your first loop, just try and pull it up a little bit more. And then on the other side, if you have too few rows in your measurement, for you, that means that your stitches are too tall and you need to try and pull it up a little bit less. So this can take just a little bit of practice. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of effort. And again, it just comes back to having a little bit of awareness about how you are working. Now, if you don't feel like doing any of that, another avenue that is open to you is to adjust the number of rows that you are working. And there are just a few things to be aware of if you find yourself doing this. So depending on the project that you are making, you are going to want to use a little bit of judgment about where you add or subtract rows. So if you're making a sweater, for example, there's often some shaping in the top section here, maybe around the armhole, or if you're working a top-down sweater, you're going to be increasing downwards from the neckline. So anywhere that there's shaping, I would be very, very wary of adjusting the row count there. So I would try to follow the pattern as it is for any increase or decrease rows, or anywhere there's shaping really. So any section where there are some even rows, where all the rows have the same stitch count, those places are really good candidates for changing the number of rows that you are working. So for example, on a sweater, from the armhole down, so the torso section, that's a very easy place to either add or subtract rows. So I often have to do this for myself. Usually sweater patterns are a little bit too long for me, so I just work less rows in the torso section, and that helps a lot. And similarly, if you're working a sleeve, the shaping is usually done from the wrist up to the shoulder, or from the shoulder down to the wrist. And around the wrist area where there are some even rows and no shaping, that's a really good place to either add or subtract length as well. And what I will say is, if you find yourself in a position where you are needing to make some adjustments to a pattern, you can do some math yourself and try to figure out what the best thing to do is. But if you have any questions at all, there's absolutely no problem in contacting a designer and asking them, explaining what you are trying to do and asking where in the pattern would be the best part to do this. And I know myself that I would much rather help someone out by answering a question or giving some guidance rather than having them follow my pattern to a T, but then end up with something that doesn't fit or that they're not happy with. So absolutely, when in doubt, ask. So before we finish up, let's do a quick recap. So number 1, make your gauge swatch large enough, ideally a 6-inch square, and measure internally on the swatch. Next, if you find that your stitches are not matching the gauge given in the pattern, there are a couple of things you can do. So if you have too many stitches in your gauge measurement, you could try a larger hook, or if you have too few stitches, try a smaller hook. Moving on to our row gauge. What you can do here if your row gauge is not matching is, number 1, try to adjust the height of your stitches. And if you don't want to do that, or if you find that it's just not working for you, you can adjust the row count. But again, be cautious and use your own judgment as to where it is a good idea to either add or subtract rows. And then finally, a few other things that you might like to consider that affect your gauge are the type of hook that you're using and the yarn fiber. So some hooks and some yarns will have more friction as you work, some will be a little more slippery and they could lead to a looser tension. So that's just something to be aware of. Next, the type of project that you're making. So if it's a scarf, for example, maybe gauge isn't as critical as making a garment, for example, where it's pretty much non-negotiable that you're going to try and have to match the gauge. And then finally, if you have tried everything else, you might want to consider adjusting your tension a little bit to help you meet gauge more of the time. And that's it. My last little tip for you is to try to enjoy the process. So I mentioned this earlier, that I am really trying to reframe making gauge swatches and taking these steps to meet the gauge in the pattern as something positive and something that's really saving me a lot of time in the long run, rather than something that I just have to do right now. So thank you so much for watching. I really hope that this has given you a good taster into the world of crochet gauge and why it's so important and what you can do if you're having problems with it. So if you do have any more questions for me, please feel free to email me. I'm sarah@nedandmimi.com and I would absolutely love to hear from you. So I hope you have a great day, happy crocheting and take care.